Because one of the traditions we have is to finish on time, so go right ahead and eat, go right ahead and talk if you can do it softly, and I'm going to go ahead and start the program. I want to welcome the justices, society members, and guests. Welcome to this annual luncheon of the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society. As I look out over the room, I see a lot of familiar faces of longtime members and also several new faces. And I want to thank all of you for your continued support and interest in the work of the Society. I'd like to take a moment to recognize some people. First, our 2004 member law firms, which are listed in the program. If you look in the program, you'll see these names: Barasat, Den and Dreiker, Butzel Long, Clark Hill, Dykema Gossett, Foster Swift, Collins and Smith, and Plunkett Cooney. Now, each of these firms have donated $1,000 or more to the Historical Society in the past year, and we thank them for their support. I'd also like to recognize our life members. Life members are individuals who've donated $1,000 or more to the Historical Society over some period of time. They've accumulated contributions which total $1,000 or more. Many of them still continue to contribute even after they're life members. There are too many, of course, to list. We have over 160 in all, but you know who you are, and we thank you also for your continued support of our efforts. Since we last met, the Society has been busy and productive, and let me just report to you a few of our recent ongoing projects. The Society continues to focus on the distribution of its various publications, including the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Reference Guide, Brief History of the Michigan Supreme Court, the quarterly newsletter, Society Update. We're also pleased to announce that in the past year we've distributed nearly 50 of our free lesson plan packets to social study teachers in schools throughout the state. In 2004, we updated and printed and distributed the new Index to Special Sessions. The new book includes up-to-date indexes of all the special sessions held by the Michigan Supreme Court since 1836. It also includes transcripts of all of the special sessions that have taken place since the Society's founding in 1988. Each current member of the Society received a complimentary copy of the book, and it looks like a Michigan report. It's actually bound and it fits right in the set. It says Index to Special Sessions. But if any of you are interested in purchasing additional copies, they're available here at the back table. I would tell you that really there is no better reference for understanding the history of the Michigan Supreme Court than this book. Oral history of Justice Patricia Boyle has been completed now, and we're working on editing that with the Justice. In 2005, the Coleman intern, Caroline Zickgraft, has spent the spring semester researching the Territorial Supreme Court for an upcoming special session recognizing the 200th anniversary of the creation of the Michigan Territorial Court. She will spend the summer working on the bibliography of resources available for those who are interested in the history of the court and of Michigan's judicial system. As you may remember, in 2003, the Society established the Big Four Writing and Research Fellowship in cooperation with Western Michigan University. Our fellow, Corinne Derefeld, has finished her first project entitled Prohibited from Using Peaceful Measures, the Michigan Supreme Court and Labor Injunction in Detroit, 1897 to 1907. And she is currently expanding her research and adding cases from the 20th century. Over the past year, we continue to update and improve our website. If you haven't had a chance to go on our website, do it sometime and look at it. We've added Homes of the Court page, and that shows all the different places that the Michigan Supreme Court met from its first creation. And it features a short description and photos of the various meeting places of the court over the years. Excuse me. Under the guidance of a committee of our board members, the Society is working to complete a project that will select and summarize some of the most important cases decided by the Michigan Supreme Court. This morning, the directors of the Society met and dispatched the business of a full agenda. We unanimously passed a resolution of thanks for longtime board members Prentice M. Brown, Jr. and Judge R. Stewart Hoffius. Prentice M. Brown served on the board of directors from 1996 to 2004. His advice and counsel and experience in the legal profession and his insights into the history of the Michigan Supreme Court served the society well. Judge Hoffius joined the board in 1992 and served until his death late last year. We salute both of these men for their long and exemplary record of leadership and publicly express our gratitude for their inspiration, dedication, and most significantly for their outstanding contributions to the legal profession and to the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society. To fill the vacancies on the board, we have recently selected 2 new board members, Michael Harrison and Ronald D. Keefe, and they were present at our meeting this morning. And so I'd call upon them and also all of the directors of the society to stand now and receive some recognition for you and some thanks for their work on behalf of the society. Directors, please rise. Thank you. The record of this annual meeting of the society just wouldn't be complete without remembering our founder, Justice Dorothy Comstock Riley, who died October 23rd last. Dorothy was dedicated to recording and preserving the history of the court and of its justices. After her retirement from the court in 1997, she attended and participated in all of our board meetings. This is the first annual luncheon that she's not attended, but somehow I'd like to think that she's here in spirit. The annual luncheon, of course, is always in honor of the justices of the Michigan Supreme Court, and we're proud to welcome all 7 of the sitting justices who are here today. You honor us with your presence. We bring greetings to you from the court, and I would call upon the new Chief Justice, Clifford W. Taylor, to introduce the court and bring those greetings. Justice Taylor.
Thank you, Wally. On behalf of the Supreme Court, I'd like to join Wally in welcoming all of you to this annual gathering of the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society. With me today, as Wally mentioned, are my fellow justices, and allow me to introduce them. First, our senior member, Michael Kavanaugh. Mike, you want to stand up, please? Marilyn Kelly. Maura Corrigan. Bob Young was here earlier but had to leave with family business. And finally, Steve Markman. Before I conclude, I want to briefly mention Justice Weaver. As you've all undoubtedly heard, Betty has announced her intention to step down from the court in October of this year. So this is the last time she will be joining us at this annual event as a justice. In that same announcement, she also stated that she plans to remain active in many arenas, and I hope that those plans include returning to this annual luncheon. Betty, would you please stand so we can recognize you? Since this Society's 2004 luncheon, we experienced a departure of another kind. That is the sad loss of a great lady, our much beloved colleague, Dorothy Comstock Riley. Hers was a truly remarkable life, and her absence is all the more keenly felt because her presence brought so much to the Michigan Judicial Branch and to everyone who knew her. Her legacy includes, of course, as Wally mentioned, this society, which she and Wally founded. Without this society, much of our Supreme Court history would have been lost. Wally, we are in yours and Dorothy's debt. I also would like to thank Wally, Angela Bergman, and everyone who contributes to the Society's work. I'm looking forward to hearing Fred Baker's recollections on John Volker, who, it seems to me, is one of Michigan's great storytellers. In one of his books, Small Town DA, Justice Volker recounts his experience as a county prosecutor, and he humorously describes how, as a young lawyer, he visualized the jury as an unpredictable and many-headed animal. Those of us who have tried cases to a jury can probably empathize with that anxiety. We also recognize, as I'm sure he did, the vital service that jurors perform for the justice system. Indeed, it is not too much to say that the jury is an essential feature of democracy. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I consider trial by jury as the only anchor ever yet imagined by man, by which a government can be held to the principles of its Constitution." In fact, the right to trial by jury was one of the objects of the American Revolution. So it is no wonder that Americans have always viewed the right to jury trial as central to our democracy. In 1892, in McRae versus Grand Rapids, Michigan Supreme Court Justice Charles D. Long wrote that the right to trial by jury, quote, came to be regarded as the great bulwark of the liberty of the citizen. Too often, however, citizens experience jury duty only as an inconvenience, an imposition on their time. And then there's the challenge of jury duty itself. Imagine what it would be like to be forced to take a college course on a subject you know nothing about. The length of the course is uncertain. It could last for days or weeks or months even. Your professors lecture you using technical jargon that you've never heard before, don't understand, and won't use again. You can't consult with any outside sources, other professors, or even your classmates. And the final exam is working with your classmates to all come up with the same answer. That's pretty much what traditional jury service is like. Small wonder that so many people have in the past attempted to avoid it. To that end, today my colleagues issued a resolution declaring May 2005 to be Juror Appreciation Month in Michigan. This is in keeping with the ABA's Law Day 2005 theme, "The American Jury, We the People in Action." I quote from our resolution, "Jury service is a privilege and responsibility of citizenship, and few civic activities provide such a direct contact with our democracy as does jury service, through which the community participates in the justice system. But our goal is to not only honor jurors, but also examine ways to improve jury service. You'll be hearing more about Juror Appreciation Month in the weeks to come. It is my hope that this event will be the catalyst for many productive discussions about the importance of jury service and how we, the bench and bar, can improve jurors' participation in the deliberative process." With that, Wally, I'd like to turn the podium back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Taylor, and thanks again to all of the justices who are here today. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you today's legal vignette speaker, Fred M. Baker, Jr. Fred recently joined the staff of the Michigan Supreme Court as a commissioner. Before that, he was a member and partner of Honickman, Miller, Schwartz & Cohn for nearly 19 years. Fred has been an active member of the Historical Society since 1998, and he served on the committee that commissioned and dedicated the official court portrait of Justice John D. Voelkler. He has been honored with many awards, including the Distinguished Volunteer of the Year Award from the Ingham County Bar Association in 2000, and the John W. Comiskey Award for Pro Bono Legal Service from the State Bar of Michigan in 1984. He is the only lawyer who has twice received the Cooley Law Review Distinguished Brief Award, first in 1988, and then again in 1999. Mr. Baker joins us today as the co-founder, the secretary and treasurer, and the trustee of the John D. Voelkler Foundation. Incidentally, I want to mention to you that on your table you will find some interesting information about the Voelkler Foundation. I hope that you will read it and take it with you, and if you're so moved by Fred's speech, which I was, I'd like you to join the society for him. Fred?
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Whatever else, I had the testament printed on paper that makes it suitable for framing. I'm told that it will last for centuries. It's one of my favorite pieces by John, and I hope you enjoy reading it. Distinguished justices, members, and guests, it is a privilege to be invited to speak about John Volker. It was my good fortune to know him in the last decade of his life, and through him to meet some other very remarkable people, including Charles Corot, who once described John as the closest thing to a great man he had ever known. Not long ago, Larry Charfus, are you here? Thank you, in person. Generously offered to donate to the foundation a letter he received from John in September of 1960. That was the same year that John resigned from the court, observing in his letter of resignation that while other lawyers may write my opinions, they can scarcely write my books. I told Mr. Charfus that I thought he should save his letter for his posterity, but that I would love to have a copy of it. So he sent me one, and here's what it said. Despite the fact that I accept no speaking invitations, they still come in at the rate of about 5 a week. I've turned down many, so many, in my home bailiwick that if I accepted one now in Detroit, I'm afraid I would have to go prepared to remain there. But since I've already turned down even more invitations in your own area, my stay might be a trifle on the uneasy side if I now accepted yours. All of this means, of course, that I'm trying to turn you down gently, with explanation. I do not fly. Travel to Detroit is time-consuming, and the giving of a good speech is not easy, which is probably why one hears so few. I am sorry. Sincerely, John Volker. When Larry Nolan called and asked me to speak about John, I hesitated because, as John observed, the giving of a good speech is not easy. It is especially difficult when the subject is as complex as John. I can only do my best in the short time available to try to convey to you why I consider myself lucky to have known him, and something about 3 of his many facets as a justice of the court, an author, and a fisherman. John was born of solid Roman Catholic German stock. His grandfather came first to Houghton Hancock during the copper boom. He was a brewer and a saloon keeper. He brought his family to Ishpeming by ox cart and established a saloon there where John spent a fair amount of time as a youth, acquiring an appreciation for the old-fashioned, and I think in the process of waiting tables, he also absorbed the rich dialects of the French Canadians and the Finns and the Swedes and the Italians and the Cornishmen, all of whom had been drawn to the mines, and we hear those dialects very clearly in Danny and the Boys and many of his short stories. John's father was an outdoorsman, a hunter, and a fisherman, which was only natural in the UP, but it was his schoolteacher mother's influence that instilled in John the love for words and reading that so profoundly shaped his life and character. He spent a large time in his youth, a large amount of time at the Carnegie Library that was at the end of the block where he lived. And he grew to love words for their own sake. He played with them endlessly. He punned constantly, and he didn't pause after he did so. It was a test of his listener. And because I share that affliction, I passed the test with flying colors, making every effort to give as good as I got in the way of punishment. If he said sprig is cubbing, it was not because he had a head cold, but because spring is when the black bears of the UP emerge from their dens with their young, their cubs, and when sprigs of new life sprout from the ground. And I'm not sure what that is, a triple entendre perhaps, but that was the sort of thing he liked to do. And it was one of his ways, I think, of judging his listeners, if they showed some sign of understanding what he had done. He had favorite lines. Once he found one that he liked, he made it a part of his arsenal. He was so often asked, for example, if he tied his own flies, that his pattern response came automatically to his lips. So far am I from tying my own flies, I'm barely able to zip one. His humor was a constant, even when as a very old man he did not feel very well. His fish camp was located at the end of a maze of two-track roads that trickle through the endless woods on the sandy plain south of Marquette. And one of his first acts after Anatomy of a Murder made him prosperous was to buy the 160 acres that surrounded the pond. He called the pond Frenchman's to prevent the curious from finding it on the map by its real name, which I am sworn not to reveal. The picture of us on the back of your program is taken at a mystery spot nearby that he showed me if I promised to write a story about it. In it, I speculated that it might have been the home of the eponymous Frenchman. He guarded his privacy jealously, but he loved the companionship of his friends. The first time he took me and my friend Rich Vanderveen to his pond, we passed a ragged basalt outcropping, negotiable only by jeep, and noticed that all the trees were festooned with mufflers and strips of chrome. Pointing to them, he explained psychological warfare. It was a way of preventing intruders from going any further. After fording a stream and passing several no trespassing signs, we arrived at a sturdy pipe and cable gate with an imposing combination lock. He got out to open the gate and gestured for us to accompany him. And the lock had 4 tumblers. He rotated them to the numbers 4, 3, 2, 1, and held it up for us to see, commenting that most of my friends can remember that. John went to Northern Michigan University and then to the University of Michigan, where he attended law school, and that's where he met his future wife, Grace. He graduated in 1928 at the age of 24 and returned to Marquette for a couple of years to work as an assistant prosecutor, but he and Grace tired of trying to maintain a long-distance relationship, so he followed her finally to Chicago, where they married in 1930. He spent the first 3 years of their 61 years of marriage as what he called a law looker for a large Chicago firm, buried in the bowels of the library and miserable in the big city. That was when he began writing, mostly stories about the UP. It was therapy for his homesickness and his unhappiness. He remarked with his customary double drift that he started writing at the height of the Depression. He was very unhappy then. He told Sue Marks, who made a film about him, a Detroit filmmaker, won an Academy Award not long ago. He told her that he believed that the very anonymity of city life is dangerous to the human animal. He hated the city. He loved the UP. At last, he persuaded Grace to try life in the Upper Peninsula, and together they returned to Ishpeming. He went first to make a home for them, and she joined him, and within 3 years, he had been elected prosecutor. He said that he was the first Democrat to hold the office in Marquette County since the time of the flood. And he continued to write using the pen name Robert Traver, combining his mother's maiden name with his deceased brother's first name. When I asked him why he didn't publish under his own name, he said he didn't want the voters of Marquette County to think he was spinning yarns on company time. But that's probably only a partial truth, because I noticed that he used that pen name before he was ever elected prosecutor. I think he was just naturally a very private man and liked the camouflage of a pen name. His first book, Troubleshooter, was published in 1943. It was one of 3 collections of stories that he called his DA books. Chief Justice Taylor mentioned another one of them. It also happens to be the first of his books that I read. My father, who wanted to be a lawyer, read it during his final illness, and I came across it among his things as a boy and read it myself. Many years later, when I met John, I told him that my father, who died when he was 24, had read and enjoyed Troubleshooter and had aspired to the law, which was my grandfather's profession. I explained that as my father's junior, I felt a certain satisfaction in having completed that ambition for him. So John inscribed my copy of Troubleshooter with a typical irreverence to Fred Baker, Jr., whose granddaddy was a judge, while my daddy had a saloon with the longest bar in Ishpeming. John served for 14 years as Marquette County prosecutor, and during that time he prosecuted some truly bizarre crimes. His respect for law enforcement is probably the most conservative aspect of his legal outlook that you will find reflected in his work on the court. Very seldom did he write to expand the rights of the criminal accused. Though even to that general observation, there was one notable exception that I will mention shortly. It was only natural that he would take his work seriously when it involved such cases as prosecuting a poacher who left a dynamite trap so powerful that it literally obliterated the hapless game warden who stumbled upon it, one of the stories in his DA books. Most of the stories John crafted from his experiences are fascinating, and they're almost always funny. The very gentle and practical solution that he devised to the persistent problem of prostitution in Marquette, which I will leave it to you to discover by reading the story, is one that could profitably be employed in many places today, I'm sure. Very clever. The stories in his DA books are wonderful bedtime reading, but his consistent success as a prosecutor also explains, as he once ruefully remarked to me, why he found himself out of a job after 14 years when he lost the 1950 election by 36 votes. Sooner or later, he observed, if you are any good at the job, you will have annoyed enough of your constituents and their friends and relatives that they will combine to throw you out of office. And that's what they did. So there was John at the age of 46 with a wife and 3 young daughters to support and no job. He did some harebrained things to try to supplement his income. Some of them remind me of the things Mark Twain did in his repeated forays into bankruptcy. But one of them is, I think, fairly representative. In the early 1950s, and it was the height of the nuclear arms race, uranium was very much sought after. So John bought himself a Geiger counter and went prospecting. He knew the backwoods of his environs probably better than anyone. And he wrote a wonderfully funny story about his experience. He thought his fortune was made when the Geiger counter started clicking crazily. He'd already planned how he would spend his millions when his claim assay returned with the single word thorium, which is a radioactive substance common throughout the UP but worthless in building the bomb. But it was about this time that he defended a case called People Against Peterson, which some say was the basis for a book called Anatomy of a Murder. He always maintained stoutly, however, that Laughing Whitefish was his only historical novel and that Anatomy was a pure work of fiction. He was gun-shy, understandably, because his client sued him for a piece of Anatomy's profits. The suit was unsuccessful to John's, I'm sure, infinite satisfaction, since Peterson left the day after the verdict was returned of not guilty without paying John his fee. The story that John crafted from that experience was rejected by several publishers before St. Martin's finally agreed to publish it. By this time in 1957, John was quite pressed to meet his family's needs. He and I agreed on more than one occasion that daughters are an especially expensive hobby. His 4 previous books, the 3 DA story collections, and Danny and the Boys were small works, and his practice wasn't exactly gangbusters. He remarked that if he could have fished all year round, he probably never would have written any books. And fishing also stole time from his practice, too. But Soapy was governor, and it was pointed out to Governor Williams that the tradition of having at least one seat on the court filled by someone from the UP had fallen into disuse. I'm sure many of you know Tom Downs, who practically invented election law practice. He was very active in Democratic Party politics, and he was very close to Governor Williams. He was sent by Governor Williams to interview the 2 final candidates for the appointment to the UP seat. Finished the standard list of questions in the interview. They asked John the final open-ended question, "Why do you want the job?" Tom says John laid a finger beside his nose for a minute and then replied, "Because I've spent my life on fiction and fishing, and I need the money." According to Tom, Governor Williams so appreciated John's candor that he chose him for the seat. John served only 3 years on the court. He was appointed to fill the last 3 months of Justice Boyle's term from Eaton Rapids. And then he had to begin campaigning right away. as soon as he was appointed. Just as he joined the court, however, Anatomy began to climb the bestseller list. And it stayed there at #1 for many months and remained among the top 10 for well over a year. Suddenly, John was very prosperous, and as he once wryly remarked, found himself a promising writer at the age of 52. The freedom that prosperity brought him may account for some of the whimsical aspects of the way he campaigned, and the joy of writing that is reflected in some of his over 100 opinions, which he crafted in that brief 3-year span on the court. He told me one of his favorite campaign techniques was to set up a small ring in a parking lot outside a busy store, and he would put on a demonstration of precision fly casting. Try to imagine anyone campaigning for a seat on the high court using such a campaign technique today. I don't think it's conceivable. Wherever he went, though, it drew a crowd, and I can certainly vouch for his incredible ability to put a fly exactly where he wanted it, even as a very old man in his late 80s, fishing in those difficult tamarack stands and alder thickets that surrounded Frenchman's. He could put a roll cast very deftly at exactly the place where a rise was occurring. Tom Downs said that on one occasion he set up a series of meetings with important party contributors across Wayne County. At the first stop, John was so enchanted by the company and the fishing stories and the old fashions that they never made it to any of the other meetings, much to the annoyance of the many party leaders that John kept waiting. On another occasion, and Judge Keith gave me permission to tell this story, John told me that he campaigned with Damon Keith, who was then a young man running for a seat on the Wayne County Circuit bench. It was 1960, and Michigan had not really yet begun to overcome the heritage of racial discrimination. There was very little experience of black lawyers, let alone black candidates for a judgeship. It was John's second campaign in 2 years, and he and Keith had hit it off. They decided to go to lunch. One of John's supporters had given John the use of his membership at a prestigious Detroit club, so John took Judge Keith there and presented himself to the maitre d'. The poor man was in a terrible pickle. On the one hand, he had a sitting Supreme Court justice with the use of the members of count requesting a table. On the other hand, the club was restricted and no Negroes were allowed. And this justice had a black man with him. He asked John and Judge Keith to wait for a moment, and evidently he went and had a table placed behind a palm tree in a remote corner of the dining room. He returned and led John and Judge Keith to the table and seated them fully screened from the view of other diners. John realized then what had happened, and he said he looked at Judge Keith, and Judge Keith looked at him, and the two of them got up and stalked out without a word. And that was the beginning of a lifelong friendship, one of the seminal events that percolated in John's very creative subconscious to become what was his next book, Hornstein's Boy. John resigned from the court only 4 days after his third term began. Apparently, it was necessary for him to serve that long in order for the governor to have the right to appoint a new judge to succeed him. So he served for 4 days, and then he returned to Ishpeming and the house he had built on Deer Lake north of town with some of the royalties from Anatomy. And after that, he never really left the UP, as far as I know. He declined most speaking invitations, and he even refused to attend the commemoration of his bust, which used to occupy the foyer outside the Supreme Court's law building courtroom. When Rich Vanderveen and I were asked to try to persuade John to attend the dedication of that bust, he wrote back to decline politely, observing that I doubt that these old eyes will ever see a city again. And so far as I know, they didn't. John published several more books in the years that followed his resignation from the court, including Trout Madness, Jealous Mistress, Laughing Whitefish, Anatomy of a Fisherman, which he called the picture book, Trout Magic, Hornstein's Boy, and People Against Kirk, which was a study of hypnosis in the courtroom and its use on witnesses based on actual Michigan case law, very much like Laughing Whitefish, which is based on 3 decisions of the Michigan Supreme Court in the 1880s. The only disappointment I am aware of in Justice Cooley, the position he took in those cases. But it was Hornstein's boy that he was referring to when he told Governor Williams in his letter of resignation that he was pregnant with book. In it, he crafted a story with a character modeled on Damon Keith and another character who resembled very closely former State Bar President Bill Ellman. Some of you may have known him. Bill had been very instrumental in John's campaigns for the court. It's certainly the finest political novel to spring from Michigan politics and possibly one of the best ever written. It contains a pithy epigram that I've never forgotten. In a democracy, those most gifted to govern are all too frequently those least gifted in the dark arts of getting to govern. One of my most treasured possessions is a first edition of that book inscribed by John, Judge Keith, and Bill Ellman, who was the Emil Hornstein character in the novel, rather. And I had the pleasure of knowing Bill and corresponding with him before he passed away not too long ago. John's opinions on the court were different in many ways from those that we read today. Each of the then 8 justices on the court had a very large opinion load, roughly triple the annual volume of opinions produced by today's court. And because there was no intermediate appellate court under the 1908, I think it is, Constitution, the opinions often concerned very mundane matters involving very small amounts of money. As my friend William Volz, who is a professor at the business school at Wayne State, observed in his recent article, which is entitled An Anatomy of the Judicial Writing of Justice John D. Volcker. And if you're interested, it's in volume 36 of the Michigan Academician at page 129, and it received a prize named after someone in this room, the Cohn Prize for Legal Scholarship in 2004. In that article, he collects a number of excerpts from some of John's best opinions, and I commend it to your attention because they're wonderful reading. In an era when overruling past decisions has become common, Professor Volz found it interesting to note that when Justice Volcker wrote to overrule a line of restrictive workers' compensation decisions, he didn't hesitate to explain why the court did so in very vivid language. This is an excerpt from Van Dorpel against Havenbush. We reject as both unchristian and legally unsound the hopeless doctrine that this court is shackled and helpless to redeem itself from its own original sin, however or by whomever long condoned, which is pretty colorful language. They just don't write them like that today. Probably in this politically correct era, it is not possible to refer to anything, any position in a legal opinion as unchristian. But that John did so, I think, was more a reflection of his desire to work in the original sin metaphor than it was a reflection of his religious beliefs. Professor Volz tells us that when he asked John if religion had a place in his life, he replied, "Yes, but I practice it mostly in the woods." He told me that once when he was in the hospital, the local priest kept asking to visit him. And John was, I guess, best described as a lapsed Roman Catholic. He said that he finally let him come in and talk because he thought it might make him feel better. I think that you get the best sense of John's religious side if you read his testament, which is there at the table. John was good enough to contribute an article to the Bar Journal in 1985, which was quite unusual for him because he was constantly asked to write for this or that occasion or publication, and he generally declined because he said he had to guard his time very jealously if he was going to get his own writing done. But in the article, he observed that the average judicial opinion is among the dullest and murkiest writing in the world. For every Holmes or Cardozo, who at their best wrote a kind of luminous legal poetry, there are 1,000 judges who appear to write with their feet. John's opinions were often a refreshing change from that diet of murk. I have my own favorite passages from his opinions, from several of which I have culled just 3. First is his wonderful use of the double subjunctive in People Against Hildebreidel, which is the famous the nudist colony case, in which he dissented so eloquently that one justice in the majority switched his vote to give John's dissent the majority. The police had raided the Sunshine Gardens nudist colony on a warrant for indecent exposure sworn out by officers who had visited the place without a warrant so that they could claim to have been offended by what they saw. John disclaimed any support for the cult of nudism, whose presumed enchantments totally elude me, he said. Nevertheless, he concluded that the conviction should not stand, observing, private fanaticism or even bad taste is not yet grounds for police interference. If eccentricity were a crime, then all of us were felons. Next is a passage that many a frustrated appellate judge has invoked after reading a badly researched brief from Mitchum against City of Detroit. It is not enough for an appellant in his brief simply to announce a position or assert an error and then leave it up to this court to discover and rationalize the basis for his claims, or unravel and elaborate for him his arguments, and then search for authority either to sustain or reject his position. The appellant himself must first adequately prime the pump. Only then does the appellate well begin to flow. That was John's picturesque way of saying that the failure to brief an issue results in its abandonment. But probably my favorite passage is one that reflects John's experience as both a practitioner and as a judge, and his sympathy for the frailties and the failings of both. It's hard to read it with a straight face because it strikes so close to home and to my own experience. It's from his opinion in Huffman against First Baptist Church. We are so often compelled to repeat this elementary proposition that we are moved to observe that it is probable that few trial judges, however experienced or learned, if given more time for meditation and research, would give again precisely the same jury instructions that they actually gave. Upon further reflection, their instructions would doubtless be less halting and redundant, infinitely clearer and more cogent and more on target, much like the compelling jury arguments that most lawyers make to their bedroom ceilings the night after the trial is over. The first time I met John, he had invited Rich and me to come meet him at a place called Paulie's Rainbow Bar. It was across from the old Mather Hotel in Ishpeming. There was no sign. You had to know it was there. And Paulie sold beer and shots. There was no food. What do you think this is, Burger King? He would ask anyone who dared to inquire if a burger was to be had. It was peopled by regulars. And we waited for John's arrival, humbly, acutely conscious that we were outsiders, flatlanders, trolls from below the bridge. John ambled in and we introduced ourselves. He invited us to make ourselves comfortable because he had a cribbage match to play. Just then a fellow came in, still dusty red with ore from his shift at the mine, and they sat down to play. John fell behind very badly and had barely rounded the corner onto 4th Street when the miner pegged to within 5 holes of home. The last hand was dealt, and things looked pretty bleak for the self-proclaimed UP cribbage champ. But John played gamely, as it were, and he had the first count. He pegged masterfully. And then he flopped a 26-point hand on the table and went out, leaving his opponent sputtering in disbelief. I have a photo of him at that moment. It was published in the Bar Journal with an article in the mid-'80s, sitting there in the booth, grinning like the cat that swallowed the canary. And then he turned to us and said, "Boys, would you like to come out to the pond?" We were stunned and delighted. We would have been happy with 5 minutes of the great man's time. He spent the day with us, showing us little oddities on the way out to the pond and stopping to pick sugar plums and blueberries and mushrooms. Everything's in season up there because the whole season is 2 months. I have picked six different berries on the same day with John. And he knew where everything grew. He spent the day with us. And then we fished at the pond, and we cooked the little trout that we caught. They were always tiny there, and very difficult to land. And then we had some old fashions, which is a wonderful drink, by the way, which has fallen out of vogue. You should order one sometime. See if you don't like it. And he told us about the time he was interviewed on television by Fred Friendly. Some of you may remember him from CBS, along with Justice Douglas and some lord or other from England. He couldn't remember his name. Fred Friendly asked each of the other esteemed judges if they'd cooked. And after Friendly finished with Lord Houzes, who went on at some length about some flaming French dish that he adored, he turned to John and said, "What about you, Justice Volker? Do you cook?" To which John replied simply on national television, after an old-fashioned, "It was a wonderful day, the first of many to come." And as we parted at the intersection north of Sands, John waved to us and said, "Come back, lads, but not too soon." And from then on, if we got a postcard that said the morels are in season or the Boletus edulis look like hamburger buns strewn across the floor of the forest, we would drop whatever we were doing and go see John. Eventually, we talked with him about starting the foundation, and John thought about it for a couple of years. And then finally he said that although it made him feel a wee bit embalmed to have a foundation named after him, it might be all right to do a few good things using his name. And he joined in the incorporation documents, which will never leave my possession. They're signed in his usual green ink. And he donated to the foundation the right to reprint some of his books, which he signed over and over toward the end, vowing that his name would be much shorter in his next life. With the proceeds from the sale of those limited editions and donations from many people who loved him, we've raised and spent over $100,000 assisting 11 Native American students to attend law school. And if you believe that all Indians have lots of money now that casino gambling has made some tribes more prosperous, you are mistaken. Our help has sometimes made the difference. And that is a difference that John wanted to make. When we asked him, when it looked like we might actually pay off the loan that Rich and I co-signed to publish the first book, Laughing Whitefish, and have some money left over, we asked him what he wanted to do with the money. And he said, Indians have to ask permission to play bingo. I want to endow a scholarship to help Native Americans go to law school. And that's what we did. And his reason for choosing that purpose will be obvious to you if you know the story behind Laughing Whitefish, which is one of the books that he allowed us to reprint. We've also awarded 8 Robert Traver Fly Fishing Fiction Awards, and Charles Kuralt called that the most prestigious outdoor fiction prize in America. John hoped that having such a prize would encourage more people to spin yarns, as he put it. And we've established a new trout habitat in a lake that we renamed for him, not far from Ishpeming, and did some fly fishing instruction for youth, and we've recovered the rights to 5 of his books that John very trustingly signed over to a publisher who had done a nice job with an edition of Danny and the Boys, and that publisher never paid Grace a nickel, so we got the rights back. It took 8 years. We also published John's 12th book posthumously, Traver on Fishing, edited by board member Nick Lyons, very famous in nature writing circles, if you move in those circles. And also a very generous contributor to the work of the foundation as a board member. And as it was mentioned, although it was too late, certainly for John ever to see it, we raised the money with the commission, with the Society's help to commission John's portrait, and Grace saw that and approved it before she passed away, just 2 weeks before we presented it to the court. On our last visit to the pond with John, he took us to a favorite spot nearby where 2 birch trees had grown intertwined like lovers. He told us that some people look at trees and see lumber, but for himself he saw the beauty of those trees. A timber company had bought this particular stand and intended to clear-cut it for pulp. "I'm not much of a lawyer anymore," he said, "but I've filed suit. And I figure if I file a motion every month, I can keep those 2 alive as long as I am." And he did. It was fun to know John, and I certainly shall never forget him. I will also never forget the day I heard that he had passed away. I was at the office when I heard the news, and I called Rich, and we arranged to meet and to drive up to Ishpeming for the funeral. And I went home first to pack a few things, and for some reason before I left, I checked the mail. And there was a letter from John. It was mailed the day he died. And here's what it said. Dear Fred, thanks for your enclosures and the sweet note from old Luigi's relatives. I must be feeling better as I'm working on my first real story in years, tra-la. The old eyes seem to be slowly improving, and I recently made that Watson Cornell Rockback Road run all alone. Deer, more deer, and even crows. Pretty soon, fishing, morels, and the magic of spring. And I've already picked a few pussy willow buds that expand in a non-bourbon vase. Gotta go get the mail and mail this to a downstate friend. Sprig. Is cubbing. Best, John. His great heart stopped on the drive home from the post office after mailing that letter, and his old fish car coasted to a stop in a snowbank not far from his home on Deer Lake. John's funeral was the most enjoyable I've ever attended, and I know that sounds strange. But it was just an assemblage of his friends who fell still when it was time. And then we took turns saying something about John. And when my turn came, I said, John did not suffer fools gladly, but he was always very kind to me. He was a great man. We can be proud that he graced our court and our state. Thank you.
Thanks to Fred Baker, as to Justice John Vogler, you now know the rest of the story. Thank you. We're adjourned.